Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Off the Wall Novels. Joining me today as my co-host is one Pringlebacker. And we're going to talk about Elective Affinities by Goethe. I have been obsessed with Goethe since reading Faust just about a year ago, and it has put me on this enormous journey of reading more German literature and reading more about the occult and alchemy. And I will say that a lot of the outside reading that I've done in order to understand Goethe better has kind of glossed over his interest in alchemy and his interest in the occult. And probably because Goethe has a very literary reputation, and a lot of the academics who cover him don't want to taint that reputation with something that might be considered woo-woo. And even though he was a scientist and some of his scientific theories just do not hold water, I think that a better way to look at him than just like a failed scientist or a pseudoscientist would be a poet that is so good that he felt the need to standardize the things that he believed through the scientific method. And so I'm going to get into some of that today. A lot of the background information that I found very helpful for understanding his more occult sensibilities came from a book called Goethe the Alchemist by Ronald Douglas Gray. And I realized while reading this is probably the first book that's just explicitly about symbolism that I've ever read before. I'm obviously a fan of symbolism just in being into literature, but I was surprised at how easy of a read it was and how engaging it was, because it can seem like kind of a dry topic, but when we're talking about alchemical symbolism in particular, I think it's very exciting. And even though some people might look at alchemy as a misstep, a failed attempt to understand the natural world that has since been replaced by actual science, I think that if you look at it through a symbolic framework, it's extremely beautiful and extremely relevant. And then also, really, it's fair play for something like literature. I can understand if you're a hard scientific materialist, this might not appeal to you. But again, it's funny to read some of the scenes in Faust and some of the scenes in this that I feel intuitively are just dripping with spirituality and occult imagery and language. And then you have an academic write about it, and they're like, yep, there's just not a lot of relevance today in this scene. Readers will find themselves baffled by what's going on here. And to me, again, this is this resistance to engage with who Goethe actually was and how beautiful and religious his writing is. And so, in general, the premise of this seems a lot drier than what the execution actually is. A lot of people have called this a scientific parable because Elective Affinities refers to the way that substances and chemistry are, drawn to one another. They're sort of destined to attract, and likewise the characters in here follow that trajectory. So there's this parallelism between chemistry and substances and then human relationships and human behavior. Pringle's getting really excited about that. And if I understand correctly, Goethe actually wrote an academic paper trying to show how different substances and different metals can influence human behavior. And there is a cool scene in the book where Ottilie, the young, attractive woman who everyone becomes immediately obsessed with, she has this ability to sort of feel different things depending on where on this massive estate she's standing. And in one scene in particular, I believe she gets this sense of doom because she's standing over charcoal. And also, there's a scene shortly after that where an Englishman comes and performs this kind of old-fashioned magic test on her, where if somebody has an ability such as that, they hold this little necklace or this thing on a string, and it swirls around just through her aura or her field. And again, it's so funny that there can be a scene like that in the book that they don't ever reveal it as a magic trick. We are to believe that's literally what happened in the scene. And then for academics to be yep, this is just about affairs and hidden passions and the dynamics of marriage in Goethe's day. And it is about those things, but again, it seems that by associating these characters with these metals and with these substances, he's not just trying to make a scientific claim, he's looking at this symbiotic relationship that humans have with the world around them. And even though the link to Hermeticism is not clear, it might elucidate some of the themes and imagery in the book to understand the idea of as above, so below. That there's going to be this correspondence between the macrocosm and transcendence and the microcosm and discrete things that humans have to engage with. And so that's a big thing that I got from Goethe the Alchemist, that a lot of his literary and scientific work was about seeing these parallels between humans and like plants, for example, or humans and metals, and humans and colors as well. And not just between humans and those things, but also like the universe and those things. That if there is this transcendent ideal that we might call God or the spiritual realm, then that thumbprint is going to be in the natural world. Now, a lot of that, like I've said, is not scientifically accurate anymore, but as a matter of symbolism, it's very beautiful. And it's something that got explored really well in another German book that I read this year that I got from this book called On the Marble Cliffs by Ernst Junger. That you have these scientists and these botanists that retreat from the world in order to study plants, and they quickly discover, okay, Pringle, you're being a little much. They quickly discover that their scientific approach is not sufficient and that they need to look to more spiritual framings in order to understand plant growth, and how a seed turning into a plant actually mirrors the process of creation. Or if you believe in Gnosticism, if there is this like transcendent God that everything has sort of fallen from, that is something that's mirrored in natural processes. And so something that is in particular explored in Faust Part 2 is the idea of colors being derived from this like transcendent color, or that there's this like godly color that all other colors radiate out from. And he blends the imagery that existence is like a waterfall or a cascade coming down from the heavens, and that everything that is substantial and discrete and phenomenal in front of us is derived from that higher ideal. So it's really beautiful and a really cool framing. And also, if I may say so myself, a huge oversight to leave out of analyses of his work. Because, like, again, if I'm so new to Goethe, and it's obvious to me as I read these books that this guy was deeply credulous for spirituality, and we shouldn't look at his failed scientific theories as something to write off. It's just that, like, in his day, he wanted to gain legitimacy, and he believed that the natural world could be understood through that spiritual framing. But again, as a matter of symbolism, it's absolutely gorgeous. So I want to get into some more of the imagery, and I'm going to start out just by talking about the premise and the imagery in Elective Affinities, and then I might get into some slight spoilers, but I'll make sure to announce that before the end. And this, what I'm about to describe, is pretty much just contained in the premise, so I'm not going to be spoiling too much here at the beginning. Pringle's being very vocal right now. Do you want to come out, Pringle? He's not so certain. All right, he might make an appearance. But like I said, a lot of this book, the actual like narrative action, is just about these two super rich people who are remodeling their estate. So we have Charlotte and Edward, and they're a married couple. And I believe both of their former spouses died, and so they are on their second marriage. And the opening scene I find very evocative because Edward is grafting branches to a tree. I believe it's either a tree or a bush or some kind of plant. He's grafting, or like taking something from one plant and putting it on another. And if we're to look at this through that alchemical lens or this spiritual lens, or to treat nature as Goethe did as this sort of like reflection of these higher ideals, then there's a lot to unpack in the idea that the very first scene that we get with Edward is him taking something from one natural resource and gluing it onto another. It, I think, is an example of him being unnatural, or him trying to kind of like violate fate through his own will. And fate and free will is an enormous theme in this book. And what it seems like is that later it's confirmed that this is something that's kind of unnatural, because they have a character named the Gardener, whose name I don't believe we ever learn. And he talks about how fruition is best achieved just naturally, that you should let plants just kind of do their thing. Here he is. How you doing, Pringle? And Edward's attempt to graft plants where they don't belong is probably doing too much, as the kids say. And then also, like I said, in them trying to remodel their estate, it could look, or we could look at that as this like decadence, or this, the idea that like idle hands are the devil's playground. And if these two rich aristocrats were not so well-to-do, then maybe they wouldn't feel the need to be continuously landscaping and continuously trying to mold something that fate might take care of on its own. Hope Pringle's not chatting too much. It's kind of making me lose my train of thought, to be honest. But that's what it ends up being about. And then very early in the book, Edward is reading from his science textbook to Charlotte and then somebody they invite to their estate named the Captain. And he gets really annoyed when people are reading over his shoulder, but they remark very explicitly that they have a symbiotic relationship with these substances and chemical processes that he's reading about in the book. So he just lays out the premise like that. It's not something you need to read between the lines or interpret in the subtext in order to see. They just tell you. It's like, oh yeah, Elective Affinities. That's the book that you're reading. And they kind of give you what's going to happen in the book very early on. So even though I'm going to get into other spoilers, it should be clear that within just the first couple chapters of this book, Charlotte and Edward's marriage is going to be derailed because they invite the Captain and then also Ottilie, who is Charlotte's niece, to come and stay with them, and they kind of crisscross. So Charlotte falls for the Captain, and then Edward falls head over heels for Ottilie. And the Ottilie-Edward dynamic is much more focused on than Charlotte and the Captain, but it's all still very important. And things get extremely trippy and then even postmodern. And obviously not postmodern by era, but a lot of the imagery that Goethe goes on to explore within their relationships feels like something that you might read in John Barth or Pynchon or David Foster Wallace, where it's so symbolic and so evocative, these scenes that he renders. So for example, at one of the really crazy fancy parties, Charlotte's daughter suggests that they all kind of recreate these famous paintings, and it gets into this discussion of the difference between an imitation and an appearance and an actual thing. And Ottilie is described as being the actual thing, that I believe she depicts the Virgin Mary in one of the paintings that she's an actress for, or a model for. And they talk about how it's not just a representation. Ottilie transcends the capacity to represent by being a model and a fixture in this live painting for everybody. And another scene that sort of gets into that theme of the difference between a representation and a reality is when Charlotte is remodeling their estate, and there's a graveyard that they have to dig up so that they can level this hill. And a lot of the families who had their relatives there and planned to spend eternity with them were upset about that. And then the architect, another character who is not named, he's just the architect, sort of opines that the monument that he's required to create kind of has to remove his personal desires because he needs to capture somebody who is dead in a monument. And that gives Charlotte the idea that that representation is actually more important than where that person was buried in the land. So if we can kind of pitch that to the families who are upset, then it might be best. So then she can kind of sweep this stuff under the rug that she dug up all of these bodies. So I'll get into something that is kind of spoilery here after I talk about some more non-spoilery stuff, because that image of people resting in the ground ends up becoming super important by the end of the book. So after the church gets kind of mad, or no, I'm sorry, the parishioners get mad that she digs up all of their family members, and so then some of them revoke their endowment from the church, and Charlotte pays it back because she's super rich. But all of that coalesces into the architect kind of remodeling the church and creating this chapel that is just rife with occult imagery. And so one of the projects that he undertakes is to, create almost like a medieval ceiling with a lot of angels and important religious figures. And then Goethe describes it as him literally connecting the macrocosm and the microcosm. And so since there's so much in this about plants and grafting branches and rescaping the ground, this is sort of, I almost will say that the chapel itself is a microcosm of the idea of a macrocosm and a microcosm. I hope I'm not blurring too much together, but suffice it to say, that's what I interpreted from that scene. And Ottilie goes into this chapel and has a religious experience. She goes in there, and it's described kind of glancingly, but she has this experience where she sort of dissociates and has this elevated this elevated experience next to this stained glass window, and she remarks that there should always be a lamp left on so that the colors can sort of radiate out into the chapel. And if you remember, that mirrors this image that Goethe describes in Faust, of all colors being derived from this transcendent ideal. And so, again, I didn't read a single article that got into that, and they're just like, yep, this is just about people busy on their estates. And it's like, guys, this is just right there. It's so cool. And then I think now's the time that I actually need to get into some spoilers. And so if you're going to read this book, I highly recommend turning the video off right now. If you're not going to read this book, just stick along with me, because it's extremely beautiful and it might encourage you to read it even if it's already been spoiled for you. But things get supernatural by the end. And again, I know I'm harping on it, my anti-intellectual, anti-academic screed, but nobody talks about this in articles about elective affinities. How one of the last scenes is a young girl that Audely's been taking care of essentially falls off of a roof, and it's described that all of her limbs are shattered. You know, and so I kind of interpreted this as that she died, and she is lifted up and then placed on top of Audely's coffin, because Audely also dies. She like starves herself after Edward comes back. And they put the young girl on Audely's coffin, and then she springs up as if her legs and her arms were never broken. And she says to the entire crowd, like you saw, Audely just sat up and forgave me. Audely just basically gave me her blessing from beyond the grave. And then this young girl is tasked with like keeping watch over Audely's body before she's buried. And a lot of people visit her. And then Edward dies shortly after, because he finally he discovers Audely has a bunch of artifacts that prove her love for him. And the way I interpreted it is that he kind of died from shock or having his passion confirmed. And they're buried next to each other. And you guys, the last line of this book, I just keep opening it up and reading it again. And again, like, after it gets into the supernatural territory, I'm not exactly sure what level of reality we're supposed to interpret this on, because a lot of the rest of it is kind of understated and framing these spiritual experiences through the characters. And then this seems to like push it, or to confirm like whatever omniscient authorial voice believes. So the very last image is Edward being lowered into the ground so that he's buried next to Audely, harking back to that idea of the monuments representing where the dead are versus like literally where the dead are. And it seems like Goethe prefers that literal placement, because it's not just about the representation, a la the paintings, it's about like the actual substance that transcends the capacity to represent something. And the last short paragraph is this: so the lovers are side by side at rest. Peace hovers over their dwelling place. Cheerful images of angels, their kith and kin, look down at them from the vaulted ceiling, and what a sweet moment it will be for their eyes when on some future day they wake together. Oh my God, like it just punched me in the gut. And even 10 pages before this, I was worried that it wasn't really going to stick the landing. Even though I loved the whole thing, I just thought, I already kind of knew that Edward and Audely were going to die, so I just thought it was going to end with that. And then he still punched me in the gut with this just beautiful breath of fresh air of spirituality and this belief in the afterlife. And I also forgot to mention that a lot of the angels that are on the ceiling of this chapel, where they are, or did I say they were in the ground? I might be getting this wrong. I did say they were in the ground, but if I understand, they're actually in the chapel. Their bodies are beneath the ceiling that the architect created. And all of the angels are modeled after Audely's face. And so, to me, that was one of the most psychedelic scenes in the book, that the architect kind of falls in love with Audely as well. And as he's painting this medieval scape on the ceiling, all of them look like her. So she is this like representation of this like higher ideal, or this like macrocosm that has come down to earth. And there's so much more that I could say about this book to tie up some of the other themes about fate and free will, and about how every new character that gets introduced has just such a colossal impact on the other characters. It makes you question if any of them even have free will, because they're so easily influenced, even though they're very strong-willed. And so I'm going to end it there just so it's not too much longer than 20 minutes, but what an amazing book. What a what? Oh my gosh, it's just so cool. 3 books in a row, I went On the Marble Cliffs, Berlin, Alexanderplatz, and now Elective Affinities. Every single one of them has affected me and explored spirituality, but just in a completely unique way. And it's just made me love Goethe even more, and I'm excited to check out more of his stuff, because as obsessed as I have become with him, I've only read like 2 books of his. So he has an enormous output that I can comb through pretty much for the rest of my life, and I'm flirting with the idea of making it just a fall tradition for myself, that like every new school year that I teach, I'm going to just read a new work of Goethe, because yeah, it's just really made his reputation makes sense to me, that I'm just speechless. Anyway, guys, my new book and my new album are coming out on Christmas. This is my older book, Lionel, Lancet, and the Right Vibe. If you want to support the channel, check those out. Check out some of my other video essays here, and we're going to leave it at that. You guys have a good day. Goodbye.